Diana, Princess of Wales, dies in a traumatic car crash in Paris. Amid the grief, the recriminations and the questions. Good evening. The Princess's body has been brought home to Britain, her life ending as it had been lived in the glare of media coverage. A midnight crash near the heart of Paris at high speed, chased by paparazzi photographers, inflicting appalling injuries from which she died at 4 this morning. Her friend Dodi Al-Fayed was also killed, as was their driver. Her bodyguard survived, but with serious injuries. Tonight, we try to piece together what happened. We reflect upon Diana herself, more icon than princess, as much doer as player, as much victim as victor. We examine how her death affects what happens now to the embattled family she leaves behind. We report to the tributes.
She was the people's princess. And that's how she will stay, how she will remain in our hearts and in our memories forever.
And amid the detention of 7 paparazzi at the scene, we try to resolve the central question. Did the establishment fail to protect her properly, or, as her brother charges, is the real villain the press? A short time ago, just 20 minutes past 7, accompanied by Prince Charles and Diana's 2 sisters, the coffin containing the body of Diana, Princess of Wales, arrived back at London's RAF base at Northolt. The plane was met by the Prime Minister Tony Blair and an RAF Guard of Honour. How she is to be buried, the nature of her funeral, will be made clear later tonight or tomorrow morning. The events leading to Diana's death began last night. She left the Paris Ritz Hotel with Dodi Al-Fayed at around midnight. Shortly afterwards, pursued at speed by 7 or more photographers on motorbikes, their car entered a tunnel where it lost control and crashed. Doctors struggled for 2 hours to save her, but she had suffered massive internal injuries. At 3 o'clock in the morning, local time, Diana, Princess of Wales, was pronounced dead. This afternoon, Prince Charles flew to Paris from Aberdeen to bring her body home. The French President, Jacques Chirac, met the Prince of Wales as he arrived at the hospital where staff had fought to save the princess's life. Earlier, the French Prime Minister, Lionel Jospin, had said he was profoundly sad that the princess's life had ended so tragically. But motorbike chases are a familiar phenomenon in Paris, with photographers eager to secure exclusive pictures, despite tough privacy laws. From Paris, Jane Bennett-Powell reports now on the crash that killed the princess and its aftermath.
Barely 3 hours ago, Prince Charles arrived in a cortege at the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital in central Paris in the British ambassador's car. He was greeted by President Chirac, flanked by the Presidential Guard, a rare French tribute. A sad Madame Chirac kissed on the hand by the Prince. And Diana's 2 sisters, Jane and Sarah, followed behind. Minutes later, Diana's coffin, draped in the royal standard, was brought out. It was placed in the hearse, ready for its journey back to Britain. Diana's 2 sisters made their own way to their car. And there were ripples of polite applause for Diana from the waiting crowd. Just 18 hours earlier, the lives of Diana, Princess of Wales, Dodi Al-Fayed, her friend, and their driver had been snuffed out. The Mercedes saloon they were travelling in was no more than crumpled metal. It had careered from one side of the underpass to the other. The driver and Dodi Al-Fayed died at once. The security man and Diana initially both survived, though ambulancemen spent 2 hours with her at the scene. They were brought here to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, but such was the gravity of Diana's injuries, they pronounced her dead at 4 a.m. Paris time, from cardiac arrest and a severed pulmonary artery.
Malgré la fermeture de cette plaie,
though we closed the wound and gave internal and external heart massage, we couldn't get the circulation re-established, and she was pronounced dead at 4 o'clock.
The Interior Minister expressed the condolences of the French government.
Lady Diana was much loved in France. She was modern, courageous and sensitive to human suffering. Her death will be deeply and sadly felt across our country.
And by his side, Britain's senior diplomat in Paris.
The Princess of Wales fills us all with deep shock and with deep grief. And our thoughts and our prayers are with her family and her friends, and with the family and friends of the others who died in the accident.
Outside the hospital, flowers, simple public tributes, began arriving at the main entrance. And people began reading the front pages, which were reset to publish the news of the crash.
It's terrible. Terrible. Absolutely shocked and horrified by the news. Really very, very sad.
I was very bad. I faced bad, crying. You know, you can see me here. You can see my hair. No, see. I just pick up my train because I brought this. Always I look at it at home. You know, the Diana royal wedding.
Because she was a princess, she's dead, isn't she? If she was ordinary Diana, she'd still be here.
The weekend had begun so differently. The evening, which was to mark the end of a Mediterranean holiday, had begun here with dinner at Dodi Al-Fayed's father's hotel. But then, as with so many of the princess's engagements, photographers were waiting outside, and the evening ended suddenly and violently a few minutes later. Diana and Dodi Al-Fayed were driven along this route in a large Mercedes by a Ritz hotel driver with a security guard, Trevor Rees-Jones. They were apparently pursued by photographers on motorbikes not unlike these. Reports speak of speeds around 90 miles an hour. As they reached this spot last night, the underpass at the Alma Bridge on the River Seine, it was midnight. The car swerved into the right wall, then smashed into a pillar in the middle of the road. Dodi Al-Fayed and the driver died immediately, minutes from the Eiffel Tower, moments from Dodi's flat.
But the car was just travelling at such speed, and it was almost as if it was in too high a gear. It really, really was tearing away. I don't know, maybe it was doing at least 80, maybe 100 miles an hour.
A number of motorbikes were impounded at the scene, and 7 people have been detained. It's understood some of the photographers worked for reputable agencies, not freelance. It's believed 2 of them arrived sometime after the crash and were held as well. The police team will report to a special unit normally assigned to high-profile anti-terrorist cases. The investigation will centre on France's Good Samaritan law, which demands that passers-by give assistance at the scene of an accident, and it'll ask what role the photographers played. Tonight, as Diana's coffin departed from the military airfield, the families of the 3 victims are in mourning, and all will wait to hear from the security guard, who's badly injured in hospital but not in danger, to hear his testimony of the crash. Jane Bennett-Powell, Channel 4 News, Paris.
To help consider today's tragic developments, we'll be joined throughout the programme by Andrew Morton, author of Diana, Her True Story, the book which shattered the public image of her marriage to Charles, and by Jonathan Dimbleby, whose documentary profile and biography of the Prince, including his admission of adultery, gave Charles's view of his unhappy marriage. Jonathan Dimbleby, the very first source out of Buckingham Palace this morning used the phrase, an accident waiting to happen. Do you think there was a sense of inevitability about what happened today?
I suppose, with the benefit of hindsight, the answer to that might be yes. But for my own sake, I think I responded and still respond like millions of people who you've been showing on television and we've heard talking throughout the day, which is simply this, you say, how could this have happened, this terrible event? It is shock, we are numbed, and we just feel a sense of bereavement, and one's hearts go out to those most directly affected. So I find it extremely difficult to, as it were, deal with the issue of whether it was an accident waiting to happen or not. It seems to me that a script can say that, and maybe there is some terrible script written, but I think shock is really my emotion.
Andrew Morton, a new love, a new relationship, and a tremendous vortex, spiralling fascination by the media. It was a pressure cooker that couldn't keep the lid on for much longer.
Well, like Jonathan, I think shock is the first emotion, but at the same time, the interesting aspect of this whole relationship was that the Fayed family had the resources to protect the Princess of Wales. They had their own helicopters, they had their own yachts, they had their own villas, they had their own bodyguards and chauffeur, as we now know. So more than at any time since the separation, and since she said she no longer wanted a Scotland Yard bodyguard, well, she had some protection. So this is the ultimate irony. She was on the threshold of a new life, possibly new happiness, and at that moment it was very cruelly taken away from her.
I want to come back to protection later in the programme, but Jonathan Dimbleby, just very briefly to conclude at this phase, a lot of people will be asking what is going through the mind of Prince Charles now, a very difficult...
If I were to seek to put myself in his mind, I would say that there would be two key things. One is coping with his own sense of loss and sense of trauma, and secondly, trying to do his best as a father with public duties to help his two sons through what must be the most terrible crisis and situation.
We shall come back to you both later in the programme. Now, the news of the death of Diana shattered Sunday morning routines right across the country. The shock of the news from Paris drew people to the Princess's London home, Kensington Palace, and to Buckingham Palace itself. As the floral tributes piled up, Diana's family, church leaders, political leaders here and abroad paid tribute to her achievements, her warmth and her compassion. Stephen Smith reports now on the reactions to the untimely death of the Princess, who held a unique position in British public life.
Within the past few minutes, the aircraft carrying the body of Diana, Princess of Wales, has arrived at RAF Northolt in West London. On her last journey home, aboard the Royal Scot, a BAE 146 of the Queen's flight, Diana was accompanied by her former husband, the Prince of Wales, and by her two sisters. RAF pallbearers and escorts of the Queen's Colour Squadron received the coffin, which was wound with the royal standard. One man carried a wreath of lilies. The party was attended on the tarmac by the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary George Robertson. Buckingham Palace sources say Diana has been accorded the same ceremonial honours as a full member of the royal family, although she ceased to hold that rank after her divorce. The Princess's body will be taken to a private mortuary in London. Prince Charles went back aboard the royal aircraft. He's returning to Balmoral to be with his sons. These scenes were none the less extraordinary for being so formal. The day had dawned in equally sombre mood. Bells of remembrance tolled over London, and flags flew at half-mast as the nation awoke to news of Diana's death. Confirmation came as most people had been sleeping, too late for most Sunday papers. In many cases, people who could never have known her grieved as if they'd lost someone close.
There was in this remarkable, young, very attractive woman a combination of the ordinary and the extraordinary. The ordinary is the way in which she seemed so like us, and the extraordinary was her ability to touch the lives of so many people, to bring grace into their lives.
The Prime Minister, who went to church in his constituency with his family, said the people of Britain felt utterly devastated.
They kept faith with Princess Diana. They liked her, they loved her. They regarded her as one of the people. She was the people's princess. And that's how she will stay, how she will remain in our hearts and in our memories.
Mr Blair's political opponents agreed to suspend campaigning over devolution in Scotland and Wales because of the princess's death.
The work that she did for so many charitable causes did actually reflect a genuine human warmth and compassion and interest. She had a lot of love for people, and that came through.
This is, although a national tragedy, preeminently a personal one, and our first thoughts must be for her close family, the Prince of Wales, and those who were related to her.
3 families have been bereaved. Mohammed Al-Fayed, the owner of Harrods, flew to Paris in the early hours of this morning to recover his son's body.
The world has lost a princess who is, quite frankly, irreplaceable, and Mr Al-Fayed has lost a greatly loved eldest son.
The princess's brother spoke to reporters at his home in Cape Town.
All those who've come into contact with Diana, particularly over the past 17 years, will share my family's grief. She was unique. She understood the most precious needs of human beings, particularly those that suffered. And her vibrancy and sparkle, combined with a very real sense of duty, are now gone forever. It is heartbreaking to lose such a human being, especially when she was only 36.
Diana famously did her growing up in public. The abrupt snuffing out of her life is clearly also a public matter.
Stephen Smith reporting. The Prince of Wales was woken in the middle of the night to be told that Diana was dead. He in turn then woke his sons to pass on the news to them. A statement issued from Buckingham Palace said, "The Queen and the Prince of Wales are deeply shocked and distressed by this terrible news." Later, as usual, the whole family, including Prince William and the Prince Charles himself, attended Sunday service at the local church. And then the Prince of Wales drove to Aberdeen and flew to Paris. Our Scotland correspondent, Rory McLean, reports now from Balmoral on a harrowing day for the royal family.
Balmoral Castle, at the centre of the 50,000-acre royal estate on Deeside, was where members of the royal family heard the news. Prince Charles telling the 2 young princes what had happened on his own. The mood around Balmoral was still and sombre. Groups of people gathered to discuss what had happened. And even the photographers who turned up were unusually subdued. Amongst the first to visit the castle, the Chief Constable of Grampian, Dr. Ian Oliver.
Grampian Police shares the grief that everybody else has. It's a terrible shock, and our hearts and sympathy go out to the members of the royal family and to the families of the other people involved. It's a terrible tragedy, and obviously we regret that it's occurred.
Flowers too began arriving, this man driving for an hour to deliver a small bouquet.
Just weighed the bouquet down, just had a couple of moments to myself.
Balmoral on a Sunday always attracts visitors. They shared a feeling with local people.
Well, I thought the world of Diana. You know, I am a royalist anyway, and I'm deeply shocked actually. I shed a few tears when it happened.
I'm devastated. Just, shocked.
It's terrible. She was such a popular woman.
During the morning, the royal family had come to a decision about the traditional Sunday church attendance. It became apparent as the royal cars left the estate for the short drive to Crathy Church for an hour-long service. All the royal family would be there, with Prince William and Prince Harry in a car accompanied by their father, appearing in public as well. Both the princes looked outwardly composed as Prince Charles sat between them. During the service, the minister, the Reverend Robert Sloane, did not mention Princess Diana by name, but he offered a prayer for all those whose lives were darkened by grief or tragedy.
In the prayers for others, we prayed for the royal family, as we always do every Sunday, but today especially we prayed for the Prince of Wales and for the children in particular, and asked that God's blessing would be with them, and that they would know his peace, and that they would know not only of God's love but our love.
A short time later, Prince Charles left Balmoral for Aberdeen Airport. The young princes are now back within the privacy of the Balmoral estate. They have the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, Princess Anne, Prince Andrew and the Queen Mother to help support them. The seclusion of Balmoral means that at least they will have a period of peace before they once again face the attention of the world's media. Rory McLean, Channel 4 News, Balmoral.
We're joined once again by the two royal biographers, Andrew Morton and Jonathan Dimbleby. Jonathan Dimbleby, there's something ironic about looking at those pictures at Balmoral, because there are the secure cars, there are the police motorcycle outriders. She had none of that. She had no official protection of any description. She died the victim of a whole catastrophe of events. Shouldn't more have been done to protect her?
Well, she does have official protection. She did have, we still say does. She did have official protection when she was on official visits, but she had made it very clear indeed that she did not want to be surrounded by what she regarded as that intrusion of officials protecting her, whether it was drivers, whether it was policemen. And she was a very determined person, and she was a free individual, and she said, I do not want that. I want to be able to lead my life. Of course, again, with the benefit of hindsight, one says, perhaps if it had been a different driver, perhaps if the protection had been better, perhaps the tragedy might not have happened.
But Andrew Morton, once somebody goes into the web of royalty, whatever, divorce, all the rest of it, you are part of it. You don't shake it off. Wasn't there an obligation upon the royal family and upon the system to protect her, irrespective of her wishes?
Well, they tried manfully to stop her from kicking her bodyguards into touch. But during what she calls the dark ages of her royal life, she always used to say that one of her greatest ambitions was to walk down a beach and, ironically, to spend a weekend in Paris without a policeman in tow. Well, when she's on official duties, or when she's with the princes, she leaves, she has a bodyguard. The last few holidays have been characterised by a nonsense of Diana being chased by photographers. I remember in Spain just a couple of years ago, she was chased by photographers when she was being driven by a hairdresser. So it was a foolish thing for her to have done, with hindsight, but it's what she wanted to do to break that web, to break the web of the royal family. She wanted to start a new life.
We'll come back to what the press did with that breaking of protection a little later. Thank you both for the moment. But the face of Diana, Princess of Wales, became one of the most famous faces across the world. The tributes from foreign leaders today bore testimony to the affection in which she was held.
I'll always be glad that I knew the princess, and always think of her in very strong and positive terms, as will Hilary. And we can only hope that her work will go forward, and that everyone who can will support her two fine sons and help them to have the life and the future that she would want.
I had the honor of hosting her a few months ago when she visited our country. And I was tremendously impressed by her.
Every newspaper and magazine editor knew that Diana on the cover would immediately boost sales. Her immense popularity was driven by many things: her commitment to charities, her willingness to support controversial causes, her glamour, and a sense that she was a woman wronged. Tanya Sillam looks back on Diana's life and considers whether she will come to rank as one of the great icons of the late 20th century.
There's a prophetic irony in some of the last images of the Princess of Wales in a public capacity, comforting Elton John over the violent death of Gianni Versace. She'd been his most famous friend and model. By herself, Princess Diana was a fashion industry, launching trends with a flick of a hairbrush. To the royal family, she brought celebrity and glamour. She was charismatic, sophisticated, and most importantly, she was sexy.
She brought to the royal family a kind of populist, highly sexualised glamour that appeared to connect it to, or appeared to modernise a very ancient, very misogynist, but very ancient project.
It was a journey in a mini-metro that guaranteed Diana the affection of the nation. She was a 19-year-old nursery teacher when her engagement to Prince Charles was announced in 1981.
How well are you coping with all the press attention? Well, as you can see, you can tell. Are you bearing up with it quite well, though? Because it must be quite a strain with all of us after you.
Well, it is, naturally.
You're coping with it all right, though? You seem to be doing very well.
Well, I'm still around.
Her rise through a steep media learning curve took on an almost mythical significance. Her origins were in fact far from humble, but it was her apparent ordinariness with which people identified. With the exception of diving, Diana's school days were mostly unremarkable, and on a visit to her old school, West Heath, she joked about her lack of academic achievement.
In spite of what Miss Rudge and my other teachers may have thought at the time, I did actually learn something. Though you would never have known by my O-level results.
It was an astonishing transformation. Diana went from being quite an obscure private individual to becoming perhaps the most famous woman in the world, which is about as much of a transformation as one person can make in a lifetime.
It was this virginal but diaphanous image that would set the tone of Diana's relationship with the media.
He did give us a hint himself. He said we wouldn't have to wait too long.
Her attempts to control her portrayal had varied and ultimately fatal consequences. At the time, her Cinderella-like metamorphosis captured the attention of the nation and forever after of the paparazzi. The unveiling of the most famous dress in history launched the icon, and a woman who in any other circumstances might have led an inconspicuous life became the wife of the heir to the throne. A billion people watched the magical progress of Lady Diana Spencer. On the 29th of July 1981, she became the Princess of Wales.
The irony is that I think she, in a sense, wasn't anything until she found herself in a marriage that was incredibly scrutinised. We all watched, the nation watched, this young woman who was an ingenue who'd been, found somewhere in the shires of England for this man, whose body was the only thing that was important about her.
It was Diana's devotion to her sons which perhaps saved her reputation at the very moment it threatened to plummet. In her role as a future Queen Mother, she defied royal protocol. She'd challenged taboos by meeting patients with AIDS. The public handshakes launched her career as a kind of Latter-day Saint, which as her constitutional position collapsed, she did not discourage.
I'd like to be a queen of people's hearts, in people's hearts, but I don't see myself being queen of this country. I don't think many people would want me to be queen. Actually, when I say many people, I mean the establishment that I'm married into, because they've decided that I'm a non-starter.
Diana's increasing isolation from her husband and the royal establishment, so poignantly demonstrated in India in 1992, seems ultimately to have endeared her to the public. People identified with the ordinary causes of the breakdown of her extraordinary marriage. Her extramarital relationships were forgiven. Her public confessions seem to have been viewed with compassion.
I think it took an extraordinary amount of courage to talk about those things like bulimia, because it's incredibly revealing of yourself. And here was a woman, I think, who was very frightened of revealing her true feelings to anyone.
The violence of her death echoes earlier 20th century tragedies. The question is now whether she, like Marilyn Monroe and Grace Kelly, will become an icon.
We've been talking about her as though she was only royal. She isn't. She's a 20th century icon. She is a Marilyn Monroe. She's a James Dean. She died like James Dean. Remember the lines in Keats, forever young, forever fair. She has become iconic. Language should just stop before that. Look at her and think it was a kind of meteor.
A witness in Paris has said that in death, Princess Diana wanted to remain beautiful. He said she remained so because, in the terrible wreckage of the Mercedes, her face was preserved.
Tanya Sillam. Well, to consider Diana's importance as an icon of modern culture, we're also joined now by the author and historian Michael Ignatieff. Michael Ignatieff, one of the problems of coming to terms with this is not only the terrible shock that she just isn't there anymore, but the placing of her and the event of her death. How do you place it?
Well, I think something extraordinary is happening as we speak. I think the history is being changed by the reaction. That is, I think I'm not alone in being completely taken aback by the strength of my own shock, regret, and sadness, and seeing it registered across the country and across the world. And that's changing what we might have said only 24 hours ago. That is to say, there's a tendency, I think, to think of her simply as a kind of manufactured celebrity confection. It's clear from the reaction that she touched people in much deeper ways. We were all much more deeply invested in this particular fairy tale than we ever dreamed. Even skeptics, and I 24 hours ago was very skeptical towards Diana. But I now feel, after her death, and I don't think this is just sentimentality, I suddenly feel a beautiful, bright, charming woman who lit up everybody's life is suddenly gone. And the world, all the cliches are suddenly true. The world is a little darker. And I think that means that this isn't just a kind of media event that will be sort of over by Christmas, as it were. There's something much deeper has happened today, and I think we all feel it. We're all surprised, in other words, by our own reaction.
But can you distinguish the difference between, and what is the difference between, what was really her? Do we know what really was her, and what in the end we made of her? Every magazine cover, we could go to the newsagents now, and without her death, they're plastered with her pictures.
Yes. I think that's true. I think it'll be almost impossible to sort out the icon and the real Diana, except that part of the trick, I mean, a trick not in an unpleasant way, but part of her enormous appeal was a kind of occasional girlish laugh. Suddenly she would step out of the icon. She would step out of the script. She would step out of the encasing of the image and suddenly show you something that was quite surprising. And almost everybody who was in contact with her felt this tremendous naturalness, this very surprising ability suddenly to be a young woman of 36 with problems that we could all identify. So that she was never just the icon. And I think people's grief is not just for an icon. You know, if she was just an icon, if she was just, say, Madonna, there would not be the grief. There was something else happened today.
Could you see the icon in her when you interviewed her for that book?
Yes, I could see the icon, and I could also see the acknowledgement of her iconography. And she
acknowledged it.
She acknowledged it, and she found it, with her self-deprecating sense of humour, quite amusing that she's seen in the same light as Marilyn Monroe. She was quite flattered to be compared to Jackie Onassis. She was rather in awe of Princess Grace of Monaco. So she was aware of her iconography, and she used that iconography in her work for landmines and all the other aspects of her charitable work, which have been so often looked at today. But at the same time, she had this deep, deep sorrow in her soul, a deep vulnerability, which so many people, and especially women, around the world could identify with. And I've had hundreds and hundreds of letters saying, please tell us the real story about Diana, because they see through what the newspaper stories, the kind of vitriol that is in newspapers these days. And they saw a woman who was vulnerable, who was alone, who was sorrowing, who was quite sad, but who was also very much aware of her position.
Jonathan, your dealings were not with Diana, they were very much with Charles. So what of the icon in your dealings?
Well, the icon was certainly there. It's the cliché that we're now all using. People lived in some ways, many millions of people lived vicariously through her because she was able to touch them with her experience. So the loss of her is also a loss of something in many millions of people. There's no doubt about that. It was a relationship where both needed the other too. I think in the princess who we just heard was a vulnerable person and in many ways a fragile person by her own account. in a way, felt the need for the media to confirm her value to other people. Without the media, sometimes I felt that she didn't know whether she even existed. And that led to this awful ambivalence that has had this tragic consequence, but that she was an icon, and more than an icon, because an icon is something that is up there that you worship from afar, and another icon comes along. In this case, I think people really feel that part of them was in her.
Jonathan Dimbleby, Andrew Morton for the moment, thank you. Michael Ignatieff, thank you. You're watching a special edition of Channel 4 News. The nation is mourning tonight the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, who lost her struggle for life early this morning after an horrific car crash in central Paris. Prince Charles and Diana's two sisters were on board the special flight bearing her body, which touched down just over an hour ago at RAF Northolt in Middlesex. Diana's coffin, covered by the Royal Standard, was transferred to a hearse, which is now conveying it to an undisclosed location. The Prime Minister, Tony Blair, led those paying the government's deepest condolences. Prince Charles will now return to Balmoral to spend tonight with his two sons, William and Harry, who've been looked after by the Queen and the Queen Mother. The body of Diana's friend, Dodi Al-Fayed, who also died in the crash, will arrive at Regent's Park Mosque in London later tonight. Now, as yet, it is still unclear just how much press photographers on motorbikes contributed to last night's accident. Mohammed Al-Fayed has put the blame squarely on the paparazzi. Indeed, tonight, a lawyer for Mr Al-Fayed has said that he will bring a civil suit against as yet unnamed parties as soon as a judicial inquiry is opened. The Princess's brother, Earl Spencer, said that every proprietor of every publication who bought exploitative photos of her has blood on his hands. Nicholas Glass reports now on the role of the paparazzi and on the difficult and complex relationship between the Princess and the press.
This is how it often is, the paparazzi giving chase in Paris 3 years ago. What they were after then was pictures of Carlos the Jackal as he was being moved in a police van. The princess was chased in private moments whenever she strayed within camera lens.
They do go over the top, and I think this was totally over the top of following on motorbikes at high speed like this.
Have you ever heard of any similar incidents?
Yes, I've seen it actually happen over in Italy. And it's happened in Spain as well.
Chases?
Yes, chases.
Her relationship with the press was ambivalent. She needed the media, but sometimes complained bitterly, despairingly of its attention.
Mom, can we just have one more 2 seconds, please? No, please. Absolutely not.
You make my life hell, she told them more than once. It was like being raped, she said.
Out. Out. O-U-T, out.
Just 5 months ago, she confronted a photographer on the street in London and, with the help of a passer-by, got his film off him.
I still to this day find the interest daunting and phenomenal because I actually don't like being the centre of attention. When I have my public duties, I understand that when I get out of the car, I'm being photographed. But actually, it's now when I go out of my door, my front door, I'm being photographed. I never know where a lens is going to be. A normal day would be followed by 4 cars. A normal day would come back to my car and find 6 freelance photographers jumping around me. Some people would say, well, if you had a policeman, it'd make it easier. It doesn't at all. They've decided that I'm still a project after 15, 16 years that sells well, and they all shout at me, telling me that. Oh, come on, Di, look up. If you give us a picture, I can get my children to a better school. And, you know, you can laugh it off, but you get that the whole time.
For the 17 years of her public life, it was a largely unrelenting pursuit. On one side, the royal photographers playing by an agreed set of rules. On the other, the paparazzi, where there didn't seem to be any rules at all. As soon as her relationship with Dodi Al-Fayed was hinted at, the hunt was on to get photos of the couple together. There was an auction for the pictures. They reportedly went for hundreds of thousands of pounds. There was hardly a newspaper which didn't report the story.
The freelancers, in your view, are law unto themselves.
Yes, the freelancers, they know the demand is there for their pictures, and in some cases they will do more or less anything to get them.
In the last few years, it's really got harder and harder and more demanding and it wasn't very pleasant.
Harder because you're fighting, competing.
More demand from the picture editors, from TV networks. You've got this demand for more and more pictures. Who is going to be the next man in her life?
A really juicy set of pictures of the princess and a suitor or a lover can fetch anything up to £1 million, so it's very lucrative work.
So to what extent are British tabloid editors responsible?
Well, I think anyone who pays that kind of money is encouraging a feeding frenzy amongst the paparazzi. These are sums which it's very difficult to resist, and they will go to ruthless lengths to get that one picture that's going to keep them comfortable for years to come.
This was Saint-Tropez just 2 weeks ago, and no escaping the relentless gaze of a battery of telephoto lenses. Both Mohammed Al Fayed and the princess's brother are in no doubt who is to blame for last night's accident.
But I always believed the press would kill her in the end. But not even I could imagine that they would take such a direct hand in her death, as seems to be the case. It would appear that every proprietor and editor of every publication that has paid for intrusive and exploitative photographs of her, encouraging greedy and ruthless individuals to risk everything in pursuit of Diana's image, has blood on his hands today.
Princess Diana and Dodi Fayed leaving Sardinia for Paris yesterday. The tragedy has brought calls for a review of privacy laws, as well as public arguments outside Buckingham Palace early this morning.
Why did they pay so much money for the photographs? Why were the paparazzi after them? If there was no money, in the photographs, they wouldn't have been after her in the tunnel.
I think there has been concern in Britain, in the press and the media, that there should be a line drawn and that it should be drawn by a responsible press and by responsible media, rather than having it drawn for them by others, with the development of a stronger press complaint system. And I'm certain that that is the right way to go.
Photos of the car crash, with the victims still inside the vehicle, are being touted around the world for about £600,000. Several papers here and in America have already said no. But the truth is, the paparazzi culture wouldn't exist at all if we, the public, didn't have an apparently insatiable appetite for its product.
Nicholas Glass. Well, we're joined now from his home in Windsor by Mark Saunders, a self-confessed paparazzi who specialised in photographing Princess Diana and has written a book about his experiences called Dicing with Di. Mark Saunders, do you feel any sense of shared collective guilt for what's happened today?
I don't personally know, because, I mean, I gave up this sort of royal paparazzi work about 6 months ago after the book was published with my partner Glenn Harvey. So I'm totally detached from it. I'm watching the news as everybody else in Britain is. I'm not watching it as a paparazzi photographer.
The book is,
and I'm as shocked as everybody else.
The book is an appalling confession, in a sense, of how desperate this whole battle with your subject is. I mean, high-speed chases down the motorway, bumper-to-bumper, rubbing car to car at 90 miles an hour. I mean, the thing is utterly mad and clearly utterly dangerous.
Well, no, that was one of the reasons why we knocked it on the head, why we stopped doing the work, because it was becoming out of control. And many of the photographers, the older, more senior photographers that have been in the business for 15, 16 years, you know, they were saying the same things to us, that it was now becoming out of control and that the new breed had taken over.
Did you really have a sense then that she might die in such an incident?
Never, no, because, you know, like everybody else, I thought Princess Diana was going to go on forever. But that book was written, you know, several publishers in London were keen on having it. And it was written as we saw it. We never thought it was
that I accept,
dangerous.
But let me just explore quickly what was in your mind. Was it in the end, well, I mean, quite perhaps understandable personal greed, desperate to get the money, or were you being driven by proprietors who were prepared to pay huge sums of money?
I think that everybody involved in the media in this work has got to look at what it was all about. There was an enormous amount of money available for photographs.
How much?
Well, I think that the pictures on the yacht recently, didn't it end up with $3 million, I think it was, on the worldwide sales. Now, that's a lot of money. We would sell pictures regularly for £10,000, £15,000. Invariably, that would be shared between 2 or 3 photographers. But that was, you know, it was the money. But it wasn't greed.
Mark Saunders, let's leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, because I'm now joined here in the studio by a former editor of the Sunday Mirror, Peter Thompson. Peter, you were once actually called into the palace by Princess Di on precisely this issue.
Yes, she called a number of editors to Buckingham Palace and said, straight out, if you don't buy these paparazzi pictures of my son, Prince William, then I'll stop taking them. And she was very worried about some kind of violent scene erupting around Prince William when the paparazzi were there and a crowd would gather. And she, in fact, said she was worried about terrorism and a kidnapping.
But you know very well that, of course, these pictures sell papers. Indeed, Andrew Morton told me earlier that one of the Sunday papers has put on 100,000 simply on shots of Dodi and Diana.
That circulation won't hold, and the underlying trend of that newspaper is way down.
But it's money while it lasts.
Very little, really. If you work out the expense of going on television with those photographs and advertising that you've got them, you're paying something like £5 a reader.
When the move comes against this activity, as assuredly it must, will it be against the proprietors and the owners who pay money for these illicit shots, which is effectively what they are, or will it be against the photographers themselves?
It'll be against the editor. He's responsible for what he buys and what appears in the newspaper legally. But the editors will say, hand on heart, my staff didn't do this. It was paparazzi, and the picture desk brought this picture in, and I was off duty, and somebody else did this or that. That's the kind of thing that happens in newspapers.
It's impossible to move against it, in short?
Just about, yeah.
Peter Thompson, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, the death of the princess has no direct constitutional implications, but her 16 years in the midst of the royal family has changed the British monarchy forever, and her loss will pose as many questions for Buckingham Palace as did her troubled life. Our political editor, Eleanor Goodman, reports now on Diana's effect on the royal family and the legacy she will leave.
Royal families have, throughout history, used marriage to strengthen their positions. When Prince Charles first introduced the then Lady Diana to the nation, it was clear he wasn't making a dynastic marriage in the traditional sense. Rather, it seemed at the time that it was a fairy tale romance. But even in the way she was presented to the nation on television, it was clear that this was seen by Buckingham Palace as part of a strategy for rooting the monarchy in the modern age.
I think it's a very complex exercise the royal family has been performing ever since the mid-60s. They made a decision, which I think was probably mistaken, to convert the monarchy into the royal family. They decided that all the members of the family were going to be components of a constitutional entity, which is the monarchy. A very different decision from that taken by, for instance, the Scandinavian monarchs. They therefore focused the spotlight on themselves, even the junior members of the family, and on their private lives. I think that the contribution that Diana made to that strategy was very considerable when she arrived. And it was terribly noticeable at the time. There was a tremendous rise in enthusiasm for the royal family.
As she emerged from her cocoon of shyness, she gained a popularity unmatched by other members of the new generation of royals. But there were dangers inherent in this approach, both in terms of the strains on her personally and in terms of the impact on the royal family. For as she began to establish her own identity, the fairy tale became ever more like a soap opera with every fresh revelation. The culmination was the publication of the account she authorised by Andrew Morton of her tortured marriage.
She was perhaps the beginning of the end for the monarchy, because the perception of the monarchy has never been the same since Andrew Morton's book, which she inspired. It was essentially authorised by her. And the family portrayed in that book of a cold, emotionless, ruthless, dysfunctional Germanic family has been one of the main contributions towards bringing the monarchy, the public approval for the monarchy, down to the lowest ebb for over 100 years. And they have a lot of ground to make up to overcome that image that she got Andrew Morton to portray.
Despite everything, she remained far more popular than Prince Charles, but her very modernity and rapport with ordinary people only served to make him and the other royals look old-fashioned. When it was finally announced they were separating, the palace and the government tried to minimise the damage to the institution of the royal family. But Princess Diana's role did inevitably change, both as a result of the and the stream of extraordinary revelations. A year later, she announced she wanted to get out of the relentless limelight.
At the end of this year, when I've completed my diary of official engagements, I will be reducing the extent of the public life I've led so far.
But both she and Prince Charles went on to use the medium of the age to make revelations and confessions which only served to damage the image of the royal family still further. When the divorce came, the two tried to minimise the harm to their sons, but the divorce stripped Princess Diana of her title of Her Royal Highness and left her in a constitutional limbo with no official role beyond that of mother to a future king. Her other importance constitutionally was to make it very difficult for Prince Charles to marry Camilla Parker Bowles.
I think this tragic death doesn't have any immediate effect on Prince Charles's situation. Obviously it removes, from the Church's point of view, the problem of an heir to the throne who is divorced with a living former wife. It doesn't remove the obstacle, clearly, of him wanting to marry somebody who is herself divorced with a still living husband. So I think the situation remains much as it was. There are also, obviously, there are complications as far as public opinion is concerned.
This January's televised debate on the monarchy showed a third of the population no longer supported the institution, a figure which a later opinion poll suggested was an underestimate. Now, out of its pain, the royal family has to try to rebuild itself.
I think it'll be difficult for the royal family to readjust, to cohere around a more old-fashioned group of people, possibly to go back, which I personally think they should do, to a more private, discreet family, and try and concentrate on the personality of the monarch alone, and not put all the emphasis on the family. I think they'll find that very difficult.
Such constitutional issues may well preoccupy politicians in the future, but tonight Westminster shares the sadness of the nation at the loss of a princess who had such a profound impact on the public's emotions and the very institution of the monarchy.
Well, in addition to Jonathan Dimbleby and Andrew Morton, we're joined now by Hugo Vickers, the biographer who's made a special study of the royal family. Hugo Vickers, a funeral is being planned. The options are presumably very wide, from something very simple and quiet, but maybe difficult to execute, to something very grand. Who's in line possibly to do this? I mean, for example, who would pull a gun carriage? Might there be one?
Well, if they had a gun carriage, it would be pulled by the Royal Navy, because at the time of Queen Victoria that changed because the army made a mess of it at Windsor Castle, and so the Navy's always pulled gun carriages ever since. But I think, I mean, what I would do if I was asked for my advice about this was to consult what I consider to be the next of kin, which is really Prince William. And he's old enough to decide, really, what he would wish for his mother. She is in this slightly difficult position in that she is divorced from Prince Charles, and yet she is the mother of a future king. And I would have thought that the nation would wish to go very much on anything that was decided if that sort of consultation was made. Now, there's various possibilities. What we have seen already this evening is pretty traditional. The departure from France and the arrival in England. The royal standard, which you will have noticed, was bordered with a piece of ermine, which is the royal standard as used by royal highnesses. So whenever they're staying at embassies and things, that's the flag that they fly.
So in a sense she was brought back into the circle of death.
Absolutely, exactly she was. The Lord Chamberlain was present, Lord Bramwell, the Lord Lieutenant of Great London, was present, the Prince of Wales, the Prime Minister. I mean, this was a pretty official return to England. Now, the next point, really, is what you do. I mean, the nation, I think, demands something rather special for a very special person who is very, very much loved. The family may have different ideas. They will have to balance these two things.
The family. Eleanor Goodman's report just now, Andrew Morton, talked of bringing the family back to perhaps how it was before, reducing it, in a sense, back to a more domestic life. Do you think that's feasible?
I think that's inevitable. I think the royal family now will be a far more domestic royal family. During the period of Diana, we saw an international royal family, a family of glamour and style personified by Diana. In the 1970s, it was rather dull, rather dutiful, still very popular. In the future, I think we'll see a quieter royal family, and one where they will retreat far more into their private lives as opposed to being more public figures.
Jonathan, Eleanor also raised the question of Camilla Parker Bowles, who, after all, really first arose formally in your own interview with Prince Charles. Do you foresee that may now become a marriage?
I have not a clue beyond what he has said personally in the past that he has no intention of remarrying. I'd like to pick up, though, on this question of privacy and public life. The royal family is part of an institution. We have mixed demands of it. We need to believe that it is doing something useful, and that involves a certain degree of public commitment and life, the Prince's Trust being one example. We also, I think, are going to say perhaps we should treat this family a touch more kindly in future, and to that extent it may be quieter.
Hugo, thank you very much, and Jonathan, Andrew, for the moment, thank you very much. Now, the death of Diana has caused shockwaves around the world, but it has been the reactions of ordinary people across the country that have been amongst the most moving. Sarah Shah reports now on the grief of a nation for a people's princess.
In the grey Sunday morning, within hours of her death, the first mourners arrived at Buckingham Palace. They sat in a silent intimacy of grief. They said they'd needed to do something, as one would mark the passing of a friend.
I don't know what else to do. What do? You can't go to sleep, can you? Got my bike and came here.
Even growing up, you remember when she got married and she did all these things, and I really just think, I don't know, it just made me sad because this was the first time you'd see her be happy.
Throughout the morning the news spread, although the headlines in the newspapers were already out of date. An almost palpable sense of shock was tinged with anger.
Just choked. I had a soft spot for her anyway, but I just can't believe it.
She just wanted to lead a normal life, but as you know, she couldn't even do that.
What will she be remembered for?
For the help she does for everyone. She helps people, and she's just a good person. Very
the way she stand out to the press, that's what she'll be missed for as well.
In life, she had told that press she wanted to be queen of people's hearts. In death, they came in their thousands and laid flowers at her home in Kensington, at the Prince of Wales's home at Highgrove, and at Sandringham. She was remembered in church services across the country. The pomp and ceremony may come later. Today they mourned a human loss.
I'm the same age as 36 as well, and that's what I just find so appalling. She was very young, and she's got two wonderful children. I just feel for the children as well.
It's upset all of us, actually. It spoilt our holiday completely. And it's very hard to believe. Things like that don't happen, do they? Not in real life.
And there was anger, much of it directed at the press.
Why should news reporters and photographers hound people? Is it not common sense to leave them alone to get on with their lives?
Maybe something, or they'll be stopped to this hounding people, because it's just getting ridiculous.
This afternoon's Liverpool-Newcastle United Premier League football match was postponed in tribute, while dancers from one of her favourite charities paid their respects, testimony to her diverse appeal.
I met her on the day that I joined, and she was friendly and a very happy person.
She had a genuine love for what we did as well. It wasn't just on, a financial gain for us or anything like that. She genuinely had a love for the dancers.
As the day drew to a close, the crowds grew outside Buckingham Palace, where she'd never quite felt she fitted in.
It's nothing to do with the fact that she was a member of the royal family. I think that she was a celebrity victim, and I think she came through it, and that was a good example to a lot of people. And, who's going to fight those people's causes now,
Sarah Shah reporting. Now, for the latest on developments in Paris, we're going live to the scene of the accident, where we're joined by our reporter Jane Bennett-Powell. Jane, what do we now know of the latest on the police inquiries into what happened with the motorcycling photographers last night?
The police have now impounded 20 rolls of film, which we understand were taken from photographers down in the subterranean roadway there behind me. 20 rolls of film which may show what the photographers did when they arrived on the scene. Did they take pictures of the injured Diana? And did they fail to help, which would have contravened France's Good Samaritan law? The other controversy is that one photographer who turned up at the scene some time after the accident from a reputable agency, the Gamma agency, said he offered to testify to what may have happened, and he was detained along with all the others.
Now, is there not, therefore, at the moment any inquiry into whether they actually helped to bring the accident about?
That will form one of the questions, of course, of the police inquiry. And another one which must be of interest is the status of the driver from the Ritz Hotel. Had he been a member of the Royal Protection Squad, the sort of driver that Diana would have had before she left the royal family, he would have been trained in evasion tactics, how to get away from such photographers. And so far it isn't clear whether this particular driver had any such training like that at all.
Jane Bennett-Powell in Paris, thank you very much. Now, joining our discussion in the studio here is Dr. David Starkey, the outspoken historian and constitutional expert. With him are the royal biographers Andrew Morton and Jonathan Dimbleby. David Starkey, what happens to the monarchy now? I know there's no immediate constitutional consequence, but this is a shattering event which has resonances which are bound to affect the monarchy.
I think they're in profound difficulties. I think it's almost impossible for them to behave well at the moment. They will be judged on how they treat Diana in death. They're widely felt, I think wrongly, but widely felt to have treated her rather badly when she was alive. But they can't get it right. Charles has gone to bring the body back to England. When I was at Buckingham Palace talking in front of crowds, there were murmurs, hypocrite, when the news was announced. If he hadn't gone, he'd have been called a brute. There is this kind of terror. How do they do it? But I think there's a much, much bigger problem. Diana, in her own life, was the death knell of the family monarchy. Her death is the absolute final blow. Now, it's not enough to have a monarchy that shrinks back to itself, that plays a decent constitutional role. It's a big institution. It needs a new message. Charles is desperately groping for this new message. King of all the faiths, multiracial, whatever. But he totally lacks the personal magnetism. As we've seen with the Labour Party, you can't reinvent something without a single charismatic figure, and Charles, alas, has a charisma bypass. Everything rests on William, and I would guess William will not want to assume that role.
Andrew, it is thought that Diana wanted William to go straight to the throne after the Queen dies.
Well, that was one suggestion, and certainly she spent a lot of her time grooming Prince William for his future destiny. She always used to say, showing your emotions isn't sissy, and that was one of her criticisms of the royal family, that they were very unemotional, very cool, very cold, and she wanted her boys to be brought up in a very different way to her husband, Prince Charles, to other members of the royal family. She saw what was going on from the inside. She wanted to change not the monarchy itself, but the style of the monarchy, and sadly the institution beat her.
We're back really to square one as far as Prince Charles is concerned, back to where he was before he started talking to you, in a way.
Let me just respond a touch to what I've heard. This is actually a day for grief and for mourning. Speculation can become very idle chatter. My view is that Prince Charles will become king, that the royal family will be treated with some sympathy now, and that it is very much too early to write off the monarchy. I don't see that happening, and I think it's odd to start speculating in that way now.
David Starkey?
I don't think it's odd to start speculating. Everybody is doing it. If you had any sense of the crowds around Buckingham Palace, they're waiting for something to happen. There's a sense of expectancy in the air. They expect something. And
There's
I think
a great deal of distress
there
in
is
the
deep
air.
distress. There's
And I think, David, that what we're going to have is now a process of mourning, which may or may not be cathartic. There will be opportunities for people to express their feelings. And all I'm saying is that I think it's early days to leap from that into judgments about whether the monarchy will survive. That's my mere point.
David Starkey, Jonathan Dimbleby, Andrew Morton. There, I think we must leave it. And that's Channel 4 News. On the day the nation lost a princess, 2 princes lost their mother, and the world an icon recognised across 5 continents.
We are today a nation in Britain in a state of shock, in mourning, in grief that is so deeply painful for us. She was a wonderful and a warm human being.
I can't believe. It's like, it just seems such a waste.
Obviously, our hearts must go out to William and Harry, these two lads who've lost their mum so suddenly and so tragically, and also to Al Fayed too, and the family of the driver who lost his life.
We liked her very much. We admired her work for children, for people with AIDS, for the cause of ending the scourge of landmines in the world, and for her love for her children, William and Harry.
I was tremendously impressed by her. She was undoubtedly one of the best ambassadors of Great Britain.
We've been talking about her as though she was only royal. She isn't. She's a 20th century icon. Remember the lines in Keats, forever young, forever fair.
The one consolation is that Diana is now in a place where no human being can ever touch her again. I pray that she rests in peace.